seeing how I don't believe you go to heaven when you die because the Bible it doesn't seem to teach that. A verse that's commonly brought forth to show how stupid stupid I am is John 11:26. Jesus says, "He who lives and believes in me shall never die." Do you believe this? To Martha. Right before or right at the scene of Lazarus being raised from the dead. He says that I am the resurrection and the life. And people will quote this at me. Jamie, do you believe this? He who lives and believes in me shall ume. It's a double negation. It can't happen. Ume in the Greek. Will not, certainly not die. Commonly translated, shall never die, for emphasis in English. But it's a strong emphasis. It can't happen. So Jesus literally says, he who lives and believes in me cannot possibly die. And it's the word for regular death. The same word. So obviously, Jimmy, you don't believe this. Christians don't die. That's false. And the reason it's false, I affirm that statement that those who live and believe in Jesus will never die. It's not possible. In its context, things have to be interpreted through the context. So let's look. I like to show this. There's only one way this makes sense. Now, there's a verse. I could also tell you that the Bible says that Jesus is a winebibber. The Bible does say that because the Pharisees accused him of that, and they said he was a winebibber. So the Bible says that, but it doesn't teach that. The Bible says Jesus broke the Sabbath. There's all sorts of problems with that. John reports that because he broke the Sabbath, the Pharisees sought to kill him, and because he made himself equal with God. But it should be interpreted by the context, which is that's what the Pharisees accused him of, but what he was not guilty of. He was guilty of breaking their fake Sabbath, right? But that's what they believe from their perspective, reported in the text. You could also say, do you know the Bible says of all of Jesus' disciples, he didn't lose one, except one. Is that a contradiction? He didn't lose one, except one. Wow, talk about a contradiction right in line with itself, right in one sentence even. Okay, that's what's going on in John here. If you look at the Greek, it says, he said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. The one believing in me, even if he should die, he will live. And everyone living and believing in me will not die to the age, Eiston Aeona. That's looking down to the you can look at it as a millennial kingdom after the resurrection, or as the eternal estate, depending on your eschatology there. But notice the word in verse 26, he literally says two things. The believing in both sentences, second line there, believing in me, pistuon. It's like faith, right? Look at 4100. And then right below it. And then, though they should die, they will live. And then everyone living and believing, pistuon, or whatever, will not die. Ume apothene. The text almost always leaves out eiston aeona, and they'll often just put in never. So the ume and the eiston aeon is just never die. It's a terrible translation. This is in John 8 as well, when he says you'll never die in the age, or in the age to come, or will not die in the coming age. So what is this saying? There's only one way this isn't a direct contradiction. We have the same word for die, apothene, and we have the same word for believing. So what's the difference between the first line in verse 25 and the second line, verse 26, which says the exact opposite thing, that you can die in this one. This one says it's not possible to die. Both lines from Jesus speaking to humans has the word believing in him. One says you can't possibly die, and one says you may die. Is what's added in verse 26 is the one living and believing. So the difference between the two is in the first one, it's just the one believing in me, though he may die or though he dies, he shall live. And the one living and believing in me cannot possibly die in the aeon. So is what this has to mean, or without being a contradiction, because it's the same word for death, which is kind of telling if you think about it. I think this is strong support for death. The idea of just being dead is just not being alive. It's that simple. What God grants to Adam in the Garden of Eden is him becoming nefesh, a living being, just like the animals. It has the spirit of life in a body, just like the animals. Only we have the image of God, which people argue about what that means, but it's some sort of ability or capability, I would argue, to have dominion, to express the love of God. And so when Adam eats from the tree and God said he would die if he did that, not only does it say that they had become like gods, knowing good from evil, like this, people often say the snake said that. That was the lie of the snake, but God literally says, now man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. So he literally says, yeah, you become like us, knowing good and evil. I take that as an experiential sense of rebellion or whatever. And God, I think that hints at God having experienced some sort of rebellion by somebody before. But the point is, the lie was the snake said you won't surely die. God said you would die. And it said, and then so now man has become like one of us. So I'm going to take away the tree of life so that he doesn't say so you'll die. He says, so you won't live forever. And the word live forever there is the word nefesh. So the thing that Adam was granted when he began to exist, meaning Adam didn't exist, and then God breathes into the body, he forms. I love it because it's like God's hands-on forming the body. Moses like intimately, you like can see him down his hands and knees like a sculptor. And then I think that kind of imagery is used in Jeremiah as well, is the idea, rather than some other perverse ideas out there about the nature of God being the potter. But he forms the body, and then he breathes it, and then he becomes alive. So he begins to have life, Adam, and he's a new creation there. Well, that life that he began to have is what God said, I'm taking away by taking away the tree of life. Because he doesn't want him to have that nefesh forever. So right there you have it. Death is the cessation of life, because Adam didn't exist before he began to exist. And that thing which was granted to him was not continued by the provision of God because of the sin until God remedies the issue, which he has done through Christ. And likewise here, simple. Death is just not being alive. The reason it says God kills the soul in the Greek in Matthew 10 is because man can kill you, but that's just the first death. You don't cease to exist in the sense of you're totally annihilated. The annihilation comes when you're destroyed in such a way, and then God will never resurrect you if you've suffered the second death. But here, the word for death is the same. No distinction. So this is a very chronological thing. He's literally saying, you die in this life, but it's just a sleep. That's what he teaches in John 11. So, and it said, we know that, I think Paul's kind of getting this from this when he talks in 1 Thessalonians, right? When Christ returns, he'll raise the saints, gather all the saints at the same time. And some will be alive. So it's like, though he may die, I'm not a Greek expert, so I don't know exactly how specific this is, but it seems like it's saying you're going to die for the most part, but leaves it open that some people may not actually suffer the first death, because there'll be some who are alive at Christ's coming that are his. So, but anyways, you die, but it's just a sleep. That's the context. And Jesus will resurrect you, and he considers that waking you from the grave. And then chronologically speaking, the next sentence is, now, after that one who believes in me, who has been made alive after dying, cannot ever possibly die again in the coming age, which would be after the resurrection from the dead. And that's what Paul teaches: the immortal body is given, and no more death wears your sting, and all that. Corruptible puts on incorruption. Otherwise, we have Jesus saying two contradictory things: that both believers can both die, and believers can not certainly have a chance die. And so he's obviously talking about the second death in the second verse, in verse 26. So people will quote verse 26 without the context of verse 25 to say, Jesus said you'll never die if you believe in him. But that's not true. You only can't die after the resurrection in the age to come. Same word for death, same word for believe. The only difference is the ones who died and been made alive. And then we have in the next verse, living and believing in me. It's chronological. The one who has been resurrected can't ever die again. No distinction in the word for death, because death is just not being alive. And those who suffer the second death in the lake of fire have no resurrection, so they're dead permanently. Now, the nature of the punishment and judgment before they are destroyed would be something you could ponder, and it's not super clear, other than that they are destroyed, the ones who are thrown into the lake of fire. But it doesn't. There's room for different views on how that works. It could be instant. It could be according to your sin. I don't particularly think that's probably right. I think that seeing that you're not saved or inside the city, and God destroys you for whatever the reasons God destroys you, will be punishment enough, in my opinion. But I think that's the only way you can read this verse and have it not make it a contradiction, unless you start inserting ideas and things in there that don't fit with other biblical theology or teachings in the New Testament. But when we look at what Paul teaches, and if we presume to read Paul through the eyes of what Jesus taught whenever possible, which I've been finding very fruitful, the Bible starts to come, it all starts to come together. So that's, I'm curious if anybody has a different view, but there you go. John 11. People do die, but they won't die in the age to come once they've been resurrected and they get an immortal body. There's a lot of implications. But tell me what you think.